What's up? What's up? What's up? This your man Umar Lee, and I first want to apologize. I've been without glasses for 9 years, and my eyesight has gotten progressively worse as I've been too cheap to get new glasses after losing mine in 2008. And I'm not quite sure how to get rid of this glare you're seeing in my glasses. So first, I want to apologize. After the tragic murder of Nabra in Northern Virginia, and of course the funeral was this past day. Muslims, like Jews, uh, bury very quickly. Not a lot of hoopla. Very simple. You wash the body, you wrap them up, say the prayer, you bury them very soon after the death, preferably within 24 hours. Um, there's been a lot of discussion about the boys running, and this video is trying to put that in context. But let me preface this by saying if you go to my blog, umarlee.wordpress.com, that's umarlee.wordpress.com, I talk about the issue of the political activists trying to hijack the tragic murder of Nubra without facts, without evidence, trying to make the murder a hate crime when the evidence does not support that, and the irresponsible forces on social media and in the media who have not done their due diligence have went with this false narrative provided by some activists. I addressed that on my blog in an article, umarlee.wordpress.com, and I want to say I have a lot of respect for the forces in Northern Virginia, for the community leaders in Northern Virginia, for the community leaders at Adams who have um, pushed back against those outside activists who have sought to hijack the tragic murder of Nubra. Tragically murdered, as many are every day in this country. Um, they defended the community against outside activists who wanted to use that death to raise money and to raise their profile. Uh, and they've really pushed away these quote unquote journalists and activists who have tried to hijack the tragic death of Nubra with a false hate crime narrative. So moving on to the boys. The boys, apparently some of them were on suicide watch. Boys who fled the scene, ran from the scene that Sister Nubra was murdered at. And the boys have been viciously attacked online. And even myself, I haven't attacked them, but I've said I don't agree with what they did. Um, but there's been a lot of vitriol directed towards the boys, calling them cowards, punks, have neglected their responsibility to protect the sisters. And I understand that narrative, and I'm not saying that's not without cause, but I want to put it into some kind of context. You have to look at societal factors. Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird, one of the great lines was walk in another man's shoes, see in another man's shoes. If you're looking at how I was raised, and I was raised and taught, father, grandfather, and this is how the boys in my neighborhood were taught. We don't run for fights. Someone hit you, you hit him back. Well, the kids now are saying if someone hits you, go run and tell the teacher. Their parents are telling them this. Um, we were very physical. We didn't sit around and play games, video games. We were out playing physical games out in the streets and stuff like that. So we had a much higher level of physicality. Um, and we were just raised a lot rougher. When we were teenagers, we were out fighting in the streets a lot. And a lot of the people on my social media commenting and criticizing the boys are people that grew up like me. We were fighting out in the streets. So when someone says you don't know what you would have done if someone had a bat and you would have ran and they were just kids and teenagers, well, someone growing up like we did, we don't quite understand it because people did pull out bats on us. People did pull out rocks on us and bricks on us, and we didn't run. And it wasn't 15 of us or 5 of us or 10 of us. It was one on one, or sometimes we were outnumbered. That's just how we were raised. We fought back. If they have a brick, if they had a bat, pole, whatever. And I've been hit with all of them. I've been hit with a bat, bottles, bricks, you name it. Um, this is not to brag. This is to say how we grew up. and how a lot of the people criticizing the boys grew up. So when they say you don't know what you would have done, we know precisely what we would have done, and we would have did what we had to do, maybe successfully and maybe unsuccessfully. But you have to think like these boys. These are boys being raised in the affluent suburbs of Virginia, going to schools where you get suspended for any kind of physical altercation, more than likely being told by their parents not to fight back. Particularly in the Muslim community, there's a low level of participation in sports. Of course, I come from a wrestling and combat sports background. Very few Muslim kids in these suburban, what I call ISNA type settings in combat sports or in football. When I go around these places, I see a lot of very skinny kids, a lot of gamers. And I'm not a big fan of gamers or video games for young kids, especially boys, because I see a lot of them neglecting hygiene, becoming unable to socialize. Not to be off color for my conservative Muslims, but I don't necessarily think gaming is conducive to vaginal access. Uh, I think sports are great for kids, and when I go around these settings like Adams, these quote unquote Islam mosques, I see a lot of skinny, kind of non-audible Muslim boys um, who are very good at school, very nice young boys, nice kids, and good families. And they're going to, and 9 out of 10 of them are going to do great in life. They're going to go to college, a lot of STEM majors, a lot of doctors, and they're going to do great. But these are not the kind of kids you're going to look at and say, okay, these are the kids that are going to go up against a guy with a bat. So we can't take the way we were raised and superimpose it upon them. Um, you know, uh, when I was growing up, most of the dads were Vietnam veterans and factory workers and blue collar workers, or some of them street dudes, tough dads, and a lot of tough boys. That's not the reality of these kids. So we can't expect them to behave like we would have. And then you're adding in the Islamic element. It's the duty of the Muslim male to protect the women and children. Of course, this isn't religious. And, I'm not a religious guy, so I'm not speaking religiously. But, and I do agree that the girls would not have went out without the boys because in the gender norms of the Muslim community, it is expected for the boys to protect them. And just generally, I think most would agree with that view. Um, but at the end of the day, these are kids, and there's another fact, and you have to be soft with them. You have to be merciful with them. Just like I believe the hate crime narrative is complete nonsense. You can't be hard on the father. He's a grieving father, and he has people encouraging him to say this is a hate crime. Charlatan activist. And with the boys, you got to look at how they were raised. They were not equipped for these type of situations. And this is why I do not believe in pacifism. I do not believe in turning your cheek. And I believe in training boys and girls to fight. And I believe in training for firearms as they get older. Because you may be a great guy, but there's a lot of bad guys out there. And a lot of times it's going to come down to, do you have the physical force to repel the bad guy? You can't wait on the teacher. Can't wait on the policeman. Can't wait on the army. A lot of times if you don't stop him, nobody is. When he's beating down your door, you don't have a chance to call anybody. It's you and it's them. So if you train them when they're young, they'll be willing and able to handle situations like this. If you don't, you cannot blame the children for running and being frightened when that's how they've been raised. So I don't think these boys, I think you have to be very easy on these boys. And in closing, I'll just say this: post 9/11, we got to look at the history of Muslims in America. definitely in terms of the indigenous African American Muslims, there's always been a hyper masculine stance. You know, the Dar al-Islam had the right, the security, the Nation of Islam had the fruit of Islam, the Jamil Amin community had the Jundullah, the soldiers of Allah. And always martial arts and firearms and monster security teams were a part of the community. And if that incident would have happened around youth at 18th and Monroe in Washington, D.C., or at Salafi Masjids, East Orange, New Jersey, or Germantown in Philadelphia, or Grand Islamic City here in St. Louis, you would have had a different scenario. Because you're talking about kids that are raised to be tough, regardless of gender, and mosques and communities that teach more of an aggressive, assertive form of Islam. Post 9/11, and Adams has been at the epicenter of this. There's been a push to teach that Muslims in America are kind of pacifists, are very soft, are very frightened at the climate of Islamophobia, are very harmless. Um, and I think another factor is these kids see that in their parents, and those are the kind of values passed down on them. So I think there's always a need to try to seek a balance. You're hard when you have to be. Sometimes it takes an asshole to defeat an asshole, and you're soft when you have to be. You're loving, you're fair, but you're firm, as the great Joe Cortez used to say. And this is not alone to Muslims, of course. Jews have historically had this attitude that in Europe, that you don't want to be seen as aggressive or militaristic because you're part of a marginalized community and you don't want to provoke the ire of the majority communities. And this is true for minorities throughout the world. So there is some historical and social context to this. Again, I just want to, in close, encourage everyone to just be soft on the boys. These are kids. A lot of people feel that they didn't do the right thing. You know, and if you're going to ask me, put a gun to my head, I said, no, I don't think they did the right thing. I wouldn't have ran, but I'm not those kids. I wasn't raised like them. So you have to judge those kids based on how they're raised, embrace them, love them, and they got great lives ahead of them. Don't ostracize them, and teach and use this as a lesson for the community, and hopefully uh, invest to get the kids into some self-defense and combat sports. I believe better than self-defense classes, combat sports. Iron sharpens iron, steel sharpens steel. And that's my 2 cents. Peace.